Welcome back, MTG Joe here. Today we are going to be covering the best decks in MTG Arena Standard Best of One. We are going to be looking at the highest win rate decks of the last week from Diamond to Mythic rank to see what people are winning the most with. Kind of a tier list of the best, like tier 1, tier 2 kind of decks. We don't necessarily bucket them in those, but more just focus on the relative win rate and kind of seeing what could win at a higher rate. Relative to that, we're going to look at the popularity of decks, kind of a metagame distribution, and then the corresponding win rate. So that could be popular, but not necessarily win the most for budget reasons, whatever it may be. We're going to get the data from what you see on the screen from Untapped GG, companion tool that runs alongside Arena's client. Aggregates user win rates, gives a bunch of cool stats. You can track your own win rates, your deck collections, whole bunch of stuff. Link for Untapped is in the video description, and then I'll paste and timestamp all these videos, or all these deck lists, not all these videos. And we have actually quite a large spread of decks today, like surprising even to me. The last few weeks with the best of one felt like I was just talking about mono red, but I have 15 decks that I'm going to be covering today. So make sure you tune in for the whole video to capture each of these decks. So some will be ladder decks, some will be individual performance decks. You see on the left-hand side, we have latest mythic players. We can see what decks individual players are having success with. That might be a little bit more off the radar. If you're looking for best of 3, we'll do that in the coming day. I will usually follows it up each after that. Before we jump in really quick, we are almost at 15,000 subs on the channel, just like 350 away. So if you haven't subbed, free, easy, helps out the channel. If you have subbed, thank you in advance. Likes and comments, as always, go a long way to help support the channel. Just helps me with the YouTube overlords to kind of get there. It's the 6th overlords of this cycle, the YouTube overlords. So we're going to look today Diamond and Mythic rank because it's still a little early. It's about halfway through the month, so folks are kind of ranking up. The popularity of the decks. Rakdos aggro has fallen quite a bit. At one point, it was as high as like 30, almost 40% of the meta. We've seen it kind of ebb and flow around 20, peaked up to like 27, and now it's kind of fallen down to the low teens. So we have Boros Auras kind of jumping it in that regard at about 13. Rakdos aggro, which is the red Leyline decks, 12.7, mono black discard, mono black mid-range kind of occupying spaces here at about 8%, 6%. We have the Oculus deck at about 5%, mono white control 4%. We have Azorius enchantments 3.5%, and Azorius control at 3.5%. So still pretty, like, we see like rabbits drop off quite a bit. Rabbits always kind of struggled against the mono red based decks, and it gets kind of amplified in that respect. Similarly, like mono red aggro has just been replaced by Rakdos aggro that we've seen in those regards. Kind of Boros tokens is fairly low too. We see it like 3%. So it's all kind of heading around that congregation of about 3% for the extra decks. So for the day, we're looking October 6th through the 13th. Happy Thanksgiving to my Canadian folks. 96,000 games of best one played. Highest win rate deck is Azorius Oculus at 63.5%. So one of the comments I made last week was I think the deck would be better served playing an additional 1-mana interaction spell, whether it be Elspeth Smite or in this case Afara's Dispersal, just to have a little bit more interaction against the red-based aggro decks. The big thing is you usually will win the long game against those decks. You could flood the board, Oculus and Hadijin hit really hard and could close out very quickly. But this gives you access to 6 1-mana bounce effects. The Afara's Dispersal gets discounted when your opponent's attacking creatures. It also surveils too, which really plays into the theme of the deck of kind of putting cards into your graveyard. Core of the deck, you want an Oculus or Hadijin in your graveyard ideally, helping hand or recommission it back into play to kind of cheat the casting cost or like requirements of exiling cards. You can fill your yard with Picklock Pranksters, but otherwise the deck's just got like cheap interaction, phantom interferences, cheap counters, 3 steps ahead, could also make clones of your Oculus or your Hadijin, Moment of Truth, Chart of Course, always to kind of draw, loot, and kind of fill your graveyard in that respect. This deck's quite popular in best of 3 as well, so if you're looking for a deck that can kind of bridge both, it could be something to consider in that respect. We then go to the Leyline deck, 62% on this one here. Apologies, I'm still recovering from COVID, so my breath gets a little short at times. So Leyline of Resonance is the card you ideally, if you're a skilled gamer, have in your opening hand, put into play double these copy, or you copy instants and sorceries that target your creatures. This deck does have the ability to kill on turn 2 through a Cacophony Scamp or a Heartfire Hero with a pump. The combinations of pump and fling will deal the damage. This one here, we have Felliness Rage, Turn Inside Out, Might of the Meek plays pretty nice with this too, just because it draws you a bunch of extra cards. Monstrous Rage is the big one here. This deck is honestly just opting to just not even play any of the Rakdos duels, so just disregarding the Callous Sellsword half. You probably, if you have the duels, just play it. It's just a failsafe. Like in some instances, you will cast the creature side, so you get some of the value there. But just a very aggressively leaning red-based deck. Variations of this deck is popping up in Pioneer Explore. I've played some versions in Historic as well. So the core of the deck is pretty stable. I have this built in paper. I'm lending it to my friend who's playing at the RC for Pioneer, so he's going to be using this version as well, Pioneer. Then go to Duskmourn's Domain deck, 4-color Domain. This deck here is a base blue-white or green-white, 60% win rate. You're playing the off colors for Atraxa, basically, but it's green-white ramp deck, using things like Overlord of the Hauntwoods to help fix your mana, give you every color, notably for Domain. With Domain, it will enable Leyline Binding to cost as little as 1 mana. You have Temporary Lockdown, Get Lost for early interaction. Archangel can ping off small creatures. Overlord of the Mistmoors can flood the board. You have like Herd Migration as a way to gain some life. Lots of incidental life gain to kind of string you along to, your turn 4 or 5 when you start Sunfalling and playing your big threats and winning that way there. If you look at the mana base, the core of the lands are going to be producing Bant colors, so blue, white, green. You shall have your brush lands. Cavern of Souls typically will name Angel, but in this deck you can also name Avatar or Horror. They both gets uncountable that way there. Fable Passage helps you enable Domain, and then you'll see the one-ofs in terms of the lands to fetch for Domain. You then have mono white control, so kind of replacing the Boros Caretaker decks, just cleaner mana, 59%. This gives you access to Lay Down Arms, which just is a scalable removal spell. You don't really care about your opponent gaining life because you're trying to play the long game anyways. Carrot Cake gives you tokens, which will trigger the Caretaker's talent. Also gain you some life. We're seeing this deck playing Enduring Innocence. Gets you card draw, so you now have like 6 sources of kind of card draw engines. When it dies, it just becomes an enchantment. Also, the lifelink could be somewhat relevant as you're trying to race opponents. Not huge amounts of life gain, but 2 life here or there that could help in the course of the game. Get Lost, Soul Partition, just much cheap removal. Sanguine Evangelist, another way to trigger both these, makes you tokens, can be an Anthem effect. Lauren, Artifact Enchantment Hate, Beza, full 4 of Beza, gains you life, makes you tokens, draws you cards, gives you treasure depending on the game. Archangel Elspeth, another way to make tokens, notably with lifelink. And then Sunfall as your sweeper. No temporary lockdown because it's a little bit more dense in terms of tokens in this build. Pardon me. Fountain Part is a big engine of the deck, just drawing you cards, making you tokens, making you treasures. You'll see the Sunken Citadel that reduces the cost. Elegant Parlor in here is a way to kind of set up Surveil. In best of 3, there's versions of this deck. They play the red land solely because they play Imidane's Recruiter for like kind of the mirrors or stuff like that, just to give you an Anthem effect for haste. And then you have just a bunch of planes that play well with the Lay Down Arms. Go to Boros Auras now, 860 games, so the most popular deck, 59%. So what you're getting with this deck here is kind of a mashup of like a mouse deck, an aggro, like mono red aggro, but with some auras. The auras you get hit the Valiant triggers for Emberheart Challenger and Heartfire Hero. So instead of pump spells, you're using Valiant. You have Manifold Mouse to double strike your team or give Trample. Sheltered by Ghost is exile-based removal that puts ward on your creature, lifelink, and gives a boost. So it can help you race by both removing, say, like Mono Red's threat and gaining you life to kind of put it at a pace. Shard Mage's Rescue's protection effect gives you hexproof. Optimistic Scavenger can put counters on things. The counters would trigger Valiant as well. Feather of Flight gives you evasion and draws you cards, so it kind of cycles in that regard. Ethereal Armor boosts your team up based on the number of enchantments you control. Also gives First Strike, which is nice. So if you have First Strike Trample, just push through a whole bunch of damages. The only downside of Boros right now is we didn't get a Verge, so still gotta play Thran Portals, which is the worst land ever. Or in contention. So Rakdos Lizards, 59%. Fairly stock Lizards list. We haven't seen too much kind of addition. Generally with these like tribal typal decks, they have like a density of creatures that you can't necessarily just slot in like the next good Rakdos card per se. Like it needs to have some synergy in terms of the archetype being lizards themselves, but the core of the deck is pinging your opponent, and then just getting extra value. So like Burning Tree Emissary style effects, putting counters, attacking their hand. This version here is opting to go at the bats, only 2 cut downs. You may in best of 1 want to go like 3 cut downs, maybe 4, kind of depending on what you're running into. In terms of the mana base, it likely can be improved a bit. You shouldn't be playing Jagged Barrens. So you just play like another Verge here or another Sulphur Springs would be my suggestion. This just seems like maybe budget consideration. Usually when I see like one of these lands, like you don't want to tap land in an aggressive deck. Like at least Vents is a creature land, so I can kind of forgive that one there. Mono black discard, 58%. So I always make this comment, and I'm glad people are kind of people love mono black discard decks or just mono black mid range decks, and they'll put like every good 4 and 5 drop because they're busted at times. Shield Druids, like all the powerful Aklizots, but then they put like 20 lands in their deck. So at least they're playing like 24 lands. In this deck here, you'd probably want a couple Myrex or Fountain Port, just some utility land in here just to kind of take advantage. You're not playing like Doomsday Excruciator that you need to worry about 6 pips. You're trading a lot of resources, like a lot of discard effects, so having utility lands in there would be good. So Fountain Port, Myrex, whatever you want to play 2 or 3 of in lieu of some of the swamps. This deck here is the more discard focused, built around Bandit's talents that kind of rewards you for your opponent not having cards in hand. So you have Hopeless Nightmare, Ruthless Negotiation, the Bandit itself, the Deep Cavern Bats in here, Thought Stalker, Warlock, Liliana, just a bunch of ways to kind of eat at their hand. Rankle's Prank is a flexible card as well. Shieldred kind of stabilizes you, gains you life over time. Tiny Bones can eat away at their graveyard, and then just a bunch of removal, cut downs, go for the throats. Lily itself is removal. So from the community, this one is from Tiago Campo. They went 28 and 8, so another mono black list that I wanted to kind of show. This is the slasher combo deck, so this is a few combos in one. So it's kind of built around Bloodletter of Aklizots that enables a lot of this. So if an opponent would lose life during your turn, they lose twice that much instead. So Unstoppable Slasher deals, when it deals damage, your opponent loses half their life. With the Bloodletter, it doubles the amount of damage. With Rush of Blood, same idea. For 5 mana with the Spree on the last mode, opponent loses half their life, and then they would lose the other half of their life. So you kind of go from there. With the Unholy Annex, if you have a demon, your opponent would lose 2 life, you gain 2 life. Instead, with the Bloodletter out, they would lose 4 life. You draw a card, gain 2 life, which is quite strong value. Demonic Council can find you a bunch of demons in the deck. You have Virtues, just a whole bunch of removal otherwise. I don't love the Saver per se. I would probably just play like more Go for the Throats, just it being situational. Not the best. I just think there's like a little bit better removal. Any of these other removals, I would probably play over the Saver. -2/2 kind of gets outpaced fairly quickly. Malicious Eclipse for the Go Wide decks kind of mixed there. So you see with this mono black deck, they have a couple of the utility lands, which I think is correct. This one is a little bit harder because you have the Bloodletter at 3, a lot more double pips. But I think playing like just 2 is right there. Put Azorius Control at 58%. So this deck is well equipped, I think, for the best of 1 mana, and we see a lot of choices that make sense. So cheap removal, we have the Smites, we have Into the Flood Mods, we have Hornlock Whale, just cheap bounce, split up, temporary lockdown, cheap interaction, destroy evil for like the enchantment stuff, Azuli Flanker, situational that can hit the graveyards, just gain your life, Flash Attacker, Sun Falls. This deck's going to win through Bezas, Jaces, Hornlock Whales. We also see a Storm Chaser's Talent in here, which the 1/1 creature probably is going to be blocking more than anything. It can rebuy you a spell as needed, and then it's more for the last mode, which is kind of like a mini Shark Typhoon. It just makes you tokens and eventually win through that regard. You also have some utility lands, but just a lot of ways to kind of control the board early, and then eventually just stick a threat and win that way there. Mono Blue Tempo, so very budget-focused deck, 55% win rate. Hadi Jin in here. So basically the core of this deck, you want to play a bunch of cheap interaction. So you'll see the full Afara's Dispersal, full Into the Flood mod, cheap kind of card draw effects, some cheap counters mixed into there. Flow of Knowledge just draws you a whole bunch of cards because you're just playing islands. Eddy Merc Crab is another great threat. So it gets cost reduced based on the number of instant sorceries in your graveyard. So it's basically blue for a 5/5 flash. It enters the battlefield tapped if it's not your turn, but basically how I was playing a version of this before. Opponent wants to go to attack, you flash it in, tap down 2 of their creatures, untap, you have a 5/5, and you just start smashing in. Galarian Terror is another creature that gets cost reduced. So you have a bunch of like 1 to 2 mana 5/5 creatures in the deck. Go to Gruul Delirium, kind of aggro. So 55%. This is kind of like borderline of what I would usually include, but the list look kind of cool. So you're playing Delirium Shell, so things that are like double typed. So Artifact Creature plays nicely. A bunch of like Artifact Creatures kind of enable that. Breakout lets you haste out stuff. You have Fear of Missing Out. That allows you to get extra combat phase with a particular creature. Samut draws you cards. Screaming Nemesis comes in, and if it's stealth damage, you can kind of redirect damage, turn off life gain. Baldur's Strayed Worm can come back from the graveyard. You have the Say Its Name Altanac kind of combo in here. The Stubhorn Burrow Fiend can get really large, and then kind of mills you in that regard. Violent Urge can give double strike. Torch is cheap removal kind of mixed into there as well. And we got a couple different Dimir decks that we'll cover. So Dimir Toxic, there are some folks in the individual standings that had like 58, 60%, but this is kind of the cumulative. So I like kind of looking at this when it's available. So 55%. So Dimir Toxic. So this deck here, Bilious Skullwender Dweller, 1 mana, 1/1, Death Touch. So it can block early, trade up. You sometimes will see even the, let me see if there's another one. I want to just... Dimir Toxic, there's a few. Let's check out this one, because I didn't see the other. So this person went 46.29. So similar kind of idea here. But there's kind of like variations. We can look at this one. This one's got like a higher win rate by STS6. So the Whisper of Dross, just -1/1, proliferate, kind of cheap removal. Anoint with Affliction is removal. Drown with Ichor, removal that proliferates. So a lot of ways just put poison counters on and proliferate. You'll sometimes see the Dimir 2-drop that comes back whenever you proliferate. But like card draw, bounce effects, the Venser. Whenever you proliferate, you either make a token or target creature gets flying and lifelink till end of turn. Distorted Curiosity can cost 1 mana to draw 2 cards. Infectious Inquiry draws you cards. It's poison counter. Rejected Perfection is a counter spell that can proliferate. Vraska's Fall. So just a bunch of cheap ways to kind of remove stuff, proliferate kind of mixed into there. If we look at the deck, they're fairly reasonable. Like the Rakdos deck, they're kind of low against in terms of win rate, but interesting deck there. Different Dimir deck. This one is from UTax, so it's Dimir Rats. So we have things like, the big thing is Kara Mix in this deck. Just lets you come in, your other rats get toxic. You look at the top 5 cards, you can put all the rats into your hand, so it's kind of a mass card draw with the deck. Skitter eats away at the graveyard. You have Vren the Relentless. This card beat me down in game day. They were playing Dimir midrange, but creature would die, exiles instead. So Heartfire Hero, Scamp, any of the fling style effects, it reduces it eliminates the death trigger, which isn't the best for them because then they don't get the effect. Makes you rats when things die. Shoreline Scout in here, draw, discard, kind of loot effects, potentially could just draw you cards. Marsh Stalker gets bonus for each other rat, and then Threshold. When you attack with 1 or more rats, if there's 7 more cards in graveyard, you can pay 3 and then return to the battlefield tapped and attacking. So it just comes back over time. Hand Hate, the Azure Beast Caller, kind of locks down your opponent's creatures. I would probably play the new Kaido over this Kaido. Pylon. The Gix command's kind of interesting because you're kind of going wide. Some cut downs. Go for the throats. Anoint with Affliction. Don't play Tree City. It's not a good card. Just play Cavern of Souls, I think. You don't really want this type of effect in the deck itself because you're not really ramping into anything. It's not really like Nykthos. It's kind of a budgety mana base too. So you can play the Verges, the Darkslick Shores. They're playing off-color lines for the ability of Wick the Whirlwind. So again, it's not a deck like with a huge win rate, 58%. Again, struggling a little against mono red, but the mid-range deck's doing pretty well against. If you just want to try something else a little different, we kind of show it in that regard. You then go to Le Shark's Dimir Control deck, 28 and 12. So this one here, just a lot of cheap removal, Ghost Vacuums for Graveyard Hate, that can be a win condition. 3 steps ahead is counter, Anoint with Affliction, Nowhere to Run, Shield's Edict, notably no Go for the Throats. So kind of situational removal in that regard. We have Intimidation Campaign, a card we haven't seen that much play. Enters, lose a life, gain a life, draw a card. When you commit a crime, get to return it to your hand. So you kind of have the engine of Ghost Vacuum, Intimidation Campaign that you can play out each turn. Invasion of Amonkhet with Render Inert that can flip it. You have the Overlord as well that kind of fills, but you could basically just, with the Overlords, kind of keep getting Jaces back, mill your opponent out that way there. Similar with Liliana, Deadly Cover-Up as a sweeper mixed into there from the deck itself. And then lastly, we have Golgari Reanimator. This one is from Kaizen. They went 54-36. So kind of a Dimir, a Golgari mid-range style shell. Yawgmoth's Faithful can reanimate the Valgavoth or Vaultborn Tyrant. You can bring him back with Virtues. You can bring him back with Shieldred, the True Scriptures. All ways to kind of get that value. You can draw discard with Collector's Vault. That also helps you ramp and get that value there. I think with Glissa, because it can remove up to 3 counters from target permanent. So if you get to later modes of the True Scriptures, you can use Glissa to kind of remove the counters from it to reset. So you can kind of restart the chain. So you can just force them to keep like destroying or discarding cards, whatever it may be in that regard, which is kind of cool in that respect. So that's it for the week. A lot of decks. Let me know what you've been thinking of the best of one format. You've been enjoying it. You still think mono red's too much? Welcome your thoughts in the comments, and we'll catch you next week. Thanks for watching.